June 18th, 1944, somewhere in the Atlantic, aboard a U.S. Army transport ship. I thought I was about to die before I ever saw America. The deck lurched beneath my feet without warning, a sudden violent roll that sent several of us crashing into one another. Someone screamed behind me. Another woman dropped to her knees, retching, her hands clawing uselessly at the steel as the ship groaned like something wounded and enormous. The Atlantic struck the hull with a dull, punishing force, wave after wave, and for one frozen second I was certain we were about to be swallowed whole. I pressed my back against the bulkhead, heart hammering so hard it blurred my vision. My fingers fumbled for the strap of my bag, as if that thin strip of canvas could anchor me to the world. The air was cold and wet, heavy with salt, and every breath burned as it filled my lungs. I had known fear before, bombings, sirens, the collapse of walls, but this was different. This was the fear of vanishing without witness, without meaning, into water that did not care who you were or which side you had fought for. Above us, boots moved quickly now. Not running, but faster than before. Leather struck steel in sharper bursts, overlapping footsteps crossing the deck as the ship adjusted its course. A voice called out in English, firm and controlled. Another answered. No panic, no shouting. That, too, was terrifying. If they were calm, then the danger must be real. The ship steadied, slowly, reluctantly, like a massive animal regaining its footing. The violent tilt eased into a deep, rolling sway. One by one, the sounds around us softened, retching replaced by coughing, screams dissolving into ragged breathing. I realized my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unclench them. That was when I felt it. A vibration rose through the deck, steady and deliberate, traveling up my boots, through my legs, and into my spine. Not the chaotic shudder of impact, but a controlled, relentless pulse. The engines had adjusted. The ship was correcting itself, moving forward. We were not sinking. The realization did not bring relief immediately. My body did not trust it. Fear clung stubbornly like cold water trapped beneath clothing. But slowly, unwillingly, my breathing began to match the rhythm beneath my feet. In, out, in, out. The ship breathed and I followed. Then came sound. Not screams, not orders barked in anger, just voices, ordinary, unremarkable. Men speaking to one another in clipped sentences, trading information, confirming positions. Somewhere above us, metal rang briefly as a tool struck steel, then stopped. A bell sounded once, clear and measured, slicing through the wind. Time was still being kept. That realization unsettled me more deeply than the storm had. Prisons, as I had been taught to imagine them, were places where time dissolved, where minutes stretched endlessly, where tomorrow was a threat rather than an expectation. This place did not sound like that. It sounded like routine, like procedure, like people who assumed the next hour would arrive and had already planned for it. Light spilled down the ladder well in pale, shifting bands as the clouds above thinned. Real daylight, not the dim yellow of bunk lamps or the flicker of emergency bulbs, but open skylight that moved as the ship rolled, catching on painted railings and steel walls worn smooth by use. The paint was chipped in places, scratched and scarred, but intact. Maintained. Someone had cared enough to fix what broke. I had been captured in Normandy 2 weeks earlier, when everything collapsed faster than anyone believed possible. Since then, I had learned to expect hands that grabbed too tightly, voices that struck before fists ever did. The Reich had prepared us for captivity with horrifying precision. We were told the Americans were chaotic, cruel, ruled by impulse rather than discipline. That surrender meant humiliation first, survival later, if at all. Nothing around me matched that lesson. As we were told to move closer to the ladder, the command came in English, then again in German. Careful, deliberate, almost polite. The man translating sounded exhausted, not hostile. He rubbed his forehead as he spoke like someone managing cargo rather than enemies. No rifles were raised. No one hurried us. When my turn came to climb, my fingers brushed the railing. Cold steel, solid, smooth where countless hands had passed over it. I tightened my grip instinctively, half expecting it to jerk away to betray me. It did not. It held firm, indifferent to my fear. On deck, the wind hit my face full on. Cold, sharp, alive. It carried the endless sound of water breaking against the hull, a constant roar softened by distance. The horizon stretched uninterrupted in every direction, a thin line dividing blue from blue. For the first time in weeks, my lungs filled completely, without dust, without smoke. A guard passed close enough that his sleeve brushed my arm. Wool, thick, dry. It carried a faint trace of soap, plain, utilitarian, the kind meant for scrubbing hands before meals. Soap meant water. Soap meant supply. Soap meant planning. It meant this crossing had been anticipated long before I ever stepped onto the ship. That realization made my stomach tighten. Nearby, a young sailor sat on an overturned crate, holding a tin mug between both hands. Steam curled upward from it, vanishing quickly in the wind. He squinted into the light, took a sip, grimaced slightly, then tore open a small paper packet of sugar with his teeth. The sound was soft but precise, the rip of paper, the faint clink of granules against metal. He stirred once, distracted, and drank again. He looked at us only briefly. Not with hatred, not with triumph, just acknowledgement. Like strangers passing on a sidewalk, noticed and immediately forgotten. I had prepared myself to be despised. I had not prepared to be irrelevant. Around us, the ship continued. She locked herself in the furthest stall. Her hands shook as she unfolded the stockings. They whispered against her palms like a secret. She sat on the closed toilet lid and carefully, so carefully, gathered the first stocking between her fingers the way she'd seen women do in films before the war, back when films showed things other than combat footage and victory parades. She pointed her toe, slid her foot in. The sensation made her gasp. It was like being touched by something that understood gentleness, something that had never known cold or hunger or fear. The nylon slid up her calf with no resistance, conforming to her skin like it was made specifically for her leg, for this moment, for this impossible evening in a POW camp in Louisiana, where German women wore American miracles in bathroom stalls. She stood, smoothed it up over her knee. The second stocking went on easier, muscle memory from another life returning. When both were on, she stood very still in the yellow light, just breathing. Then she looked down. Her legs looked like they belonged to someone else. Someone who hadn't spent 3 years in uniform, hadn't watched cities burn, hadn't learned to sleep through artillery. The nylon caught the light and made her skin look porcelain smooth, magazine perfect, American. She ran her hands down her thighs. The sensation was obscene, decadent, beautiful. She started to cry. The door opened. Etta froze, hands still on her legs, tears still wet on her face. Through the gap under the stall she could see boots, prison-issue boots identical to her own. Etta, Waltraud's voice, rough from years of smoking whatever tobacco the Kriegsmarine could scrounge. That you? Etta couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. Waltraud pushed the stall door. It wasn't locked. The older woman stood there in her threadbare nightgown, hair in curlers made from torn rags, and stared at Etta's legs with an expression like she'd been shot. The silence stretched. Moths battered against the light bulb. Somewhere in the camp, someone was playing a harmonica. Lily Marlene. Always Lily Marlene. Then Waltraud started laughing. Not a giggle, not a chuckle. A full-body laugh that bent her double, hands on her knees, gasping for air between peals of hysteria. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like machine gun fire. Etta started laughing too. She couldn't help it. The absurdity crashed over her. She was standing in an American prison latrine wearing American nylon stockings while American guards patrolled outside, and somewhere across the ocean, Germany was ash and rubble. And here she was, here they both were, laughing like lunatics because her legs looked good. The laughter turned to sobs without warning. Waltraud grabbed her, pulled her close. They clung to each other in that dim bathroom. Two German women crying over stockings, over everything the stockings meant, over the fact that something this delicate and pointless existed while their belongings with quiet desperation. Canvas bags, scarves, a photograph pressed flat between fingers as if it might disappear if released. No one spoke loudly. Fear, in close quarters, becomes careful. It listens. A wave struck harder than the rest, sending a violent shudder through the hull. Someone cried out. I felt the deck tilt just enough to send my stomach climbing into my throat. My knees bent instinctively, bracing for a fall that did not come. Above us, footsteps crossed the deck again. They were slower now, measured. The sound was unmistakable. Boots, leather soles striking steel. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. They moved past the ladder opening, paused, then continued on. No one ran. No one shouted. That was worse than panic. In Germany, in occupied territories, control was always loud. It announced itself. Orders cracked like whips through the air, reminding everyone exactly who held power. Silence meant something had gone wrong. Silence meant punishment was coming. Here, silence seemed to mean confidence. I had overheard numbers before our capture, whispers between officers, fragments of intercepted broadcasts. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers taken prisoner in Africa, in Italy, now in France. Too many for Britain to hold. Too many mouths to feed on an island already stretched thin. And so the Americans did something unthinkable. They shipped us across an ocean. Liberty ships, they were called. Built faster than U-boats could sink them. Convoys stretching farther than the eye could see, guarded by destroyers and aircraft, daring the Atlantic to stop them. It was said America launched a ship every few days. Some said every day. I did not know which to believe, only that the scale of it frightened even our officers. Germany measured strength in discipline and sacrifice. America measured it in logistics. Another wave struck. The lights flickered, not off, just briefly dim, before returning to full strength. A collective breath was held, then released. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure the others could hear it. If the ship went down, I knew what would happen. There would not be enough lifeboats for us. Prisoners were always last. I pressed my back against the bulkhead, the cold seeping through my uniform. My mind raced ahead of events, rehearsing terror, drowning in darkness. Cold so sharp it erased thought. Hands clawing at water that offered no resistance, no mercy. I had been taught to fear bullets, bombs, interrogations. No one had taught me how to fear the sea. A guard appeared at the base of the ladder. He did not descend. He leaned casually against the rail, one hand resting on the steel, the other holding a clipboard. He scanned the space below with a practiced glance, checking faces, counting heads. His rifle hung at his side, untouched. He did not raise his voice. He did not meet anyone's eyes for long. When he spoke, it was only to the translator beside him. "Tell them we'll be riding it out," he said. "No need to crowd the ladder." The words were relayed in German, carefully, almost gently. No need to crowd. As if we were commuters delayed by weather, not prisoners waiting for death. That terrified me more than cruelty would have. Because cruelty, I understood. Cruelty fit the world I knew. It had rules, even if they were brutal ones. This calm refusal to use fear felt like standing on unfamiliar ground without a map. I remembered a story an older sergeant once told about surrendering to Americans in North Africa. He said they had been searched, fed, and marched away without a single blow. At the time, we had laughed at him, called him soft, said he had been lucky. Now, pressed into the belly of a ship crossing an ocean under enemy control, I wondered if he had been telling the truth. The sea battered the hull again, less violently this time. The ship responded without drama, its engines adjusting, its course correcting. The vibration beneath my feet remained steady, stubborn. The vessel did not flinch. Neither did the men guarding us. No chains clinked, no rifle butts struck steel. Control was maintained through space, through procedure, through the unspoken certainty that resistance was unnecessary. We were afraid because we were supposed to be. They were calm because they did not need us to be afraid. That difference lodged itself deep inside me, unwelcome and sharp. I had believed power always announced itself through force. That order required terror. That discipline came from pain. Everything around me contradicted that belief, quietly, relentlessly. As the storm eased and the ship pressed on, I realized something with a clarity that made my chest tighten. If the Americans wanted to hurt us, they would have done it already. If they wanted us broken, they would not have bothered explaining anything at all. And that realization, that we were completely at their mercy and they did not seem interested in using it, was the most frightening thought of all, because it meant whatever came next would not be simple. It would not be familiar. And I had no idea how to prepare myself for a captivity that did not look like cruelty, but something far more unsettling. Restraint. The sea did not calm when the fear settled. It waited. The storm eased just enough to lull us into a fragile rhythm, rolling instead of crashing, breathing instead of striking. The lights below deck steadied. The women around me loosened their grips on bags and sleeves, though no one truly relaxed. Fear, when it has nowhere to go, simply changes shape. Then the order came again. We were to go back up to the deck, not all at once. Small groups, controlled. The words were delivered calmly, first in English, then in German. No urgency, no explanation. That absence was its own kind of pressure. If this was where something terrible would happen, it would happen above, in the open, where the sea could swallow sound and evidence alike. I climbed the ladder with my heart pounding against my ribs. The steel rungs were slick with moisture, cold against my palms. With each step, the air grew sharper, cleaner, louder. Wind pressed against the opening like a living thing, impatient. On deck, the Atlantic had changed its mind again. The sky was darker now, clouds layered thick and low, their edges torn by wind. The horizon rose and fell with the ship's motion, a slow, nauseating rhythm. Waves struck the hull at an angle, sending sheets of spray across the deck. The salt burned my eyes. My hair whipped loose from its pins, stinging my cheeks. I moved toward the rail with the others, careful, measured, every step deliberate. The deck was slick beneath my boots. Not ice, but close enough to remind me how easily balance could be taken away. A wave hit harder than expected. The ship lurched, not violently, but sharply, enough to break the fragile contract my body had made with gravity. I reached instinctively for the rail. My hand missed. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing beneath my feet but motion. The deck tilted away from me and the world narrowed to noise and wind and the sudden certainty that I was falling. I remember the sound first. Not a scream, mine never made it out, but the rush of air tearing past my ears as I pitched forward. My shoulder struck the rail, hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Pain flared white and hot, then vanished beneath something colder. Water. The Atlantic swallowed me in an instant. The cold was not gradual. It did not creep. It slammed into me, crushing, absolute, stealing the air from my chest as if my lungs had been struck. My mouth opened without permission, and salt water rushed in, burning my throat. I tried to inhale and found nothing to pull from. I can't breathe. The thought was not a sentence. It was a command, a panic stripped of language. My arms flailed uselessly, fingers grasping at water that offered no resistance. My uniform grew heavy, dragging me downward. The world above fractured into noise and shadow and light I could no longer reach. I did not think of Germany. I did not think of the war. I thought only of air. Hands broke the surface near me. Not a rope, not a pole. Hands. Strong fingers closed around my arm, then slipped as a wave surged between us. Someone shouted, English, sharp and urgent, but I could not make out the words. Another splash hit my face harder than the rest. Then there was a weight beside me, solid and deliberate. A body. An American soldier surfaced, gasping, his cap gone, hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes locked on mine, not with fear, not with calculation, but with focus so intense it cut through the chaos. He grabbed me again, this time with both hands. The shock of human contact, warmth against the killing cold, jarred something loose inside me. I tried to scream, swallowed water instead, coughed violently. My chest burned as if it were being torn apart from the inside. "I can't," I tried to say. Nothing came out. Another splash. Another body in the water. A second soldier. He did not hesitate. He did not look back at the ship for permission. He simply appeared, one arm looping under mine, the other bracing against the swell. Together they worked without speaking. Movements practiced and instinctive. They turned me toward the hull, timing their effort between waves. I felt myself being lifted, inch by agonizing inch, the sea fighting them for possession. My boots scraped against steel. Hands reached down from above, gripping fabric, wrists, anything they could hold. Someone showed it again. Orders, maybe, or encouragement. It did not matter. The next thing I knew, I was no longer in the water. I collapsed onto the deck in a heap of limbs and soaked cloth, my body convulsing as salt water poured from my mouth. I retched uncontrollably, chest heaving, each breath a jagged struggle. The world spun. The sky reeled above me, gray and merciless. A heavy weight settled over my shoulders. A blanket, thick, wool, scratchy against my skin but blessedly warm. Someone rolled me onto my side. A hand pressed firmly between my shoulder blades, rhythmic, purposeful. I coughed again, violently, and then air finally rushed back in. A ragged, painful gift. "Easy," a voice said. Close, calm. "You're all right. Breathe." I clung to that word as if it were a lifeline. Breathe. Another blanket appeared, layered over the first. I felt hands at my boots, tugging them off. Someone pressed a metal cup to my lips. I smelled something sharp and comforting. Hot water. I sipped without thinking. The heat burned my tongue, then spread downward, a thin line of warmth cutting through the cold, lodged in my chest. The two soldiers who had pulled me from the sea were still there. One of them was shaking violently, teeth chattering, his uniform soaked through. Someone draped a blanket around his shoulders, pushed a cigarette into his hand. He fumbled with it, laughing once, breathless and incredulous, before managing to light it with fingers that barely obeyed him. The other knelt nearby, hands on his knees, head bowed as he caught his breath. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the deck, pooling at his feet. When he looked up, his gaze met mine again. "You scared us," he said, not accusing, almost gentle. I stared at him, my vision blurred with tears and salt and exhaustion. Words gathered in my throat, tangled and useless. "Why?" I finally managed, the sound hoarse, barely audible. "Why? You jump." He frowned slightly, as if the question itself puzzled him. "Because you fell," he said. Then, after a moment, "Because you were drowning." No speech, no explanation, no reference to uniforms or sides or war. Just fact. Around us, the ship resumed its rhythm. Sailors returned to their posts. Guards stepped back, into position. Someone laughed quietly, the tension releasing in small, human ways. The Atlantic continued its restless motion, indifferent to what had just happened. I lay there wrapped in American wool, breathing American air, my life held together by the hands of men who had every reason to let me disappear beneath the waves. I thought of everything I had been taught. I thought of what I had expected. And as the cold slowly retreated from my bones, something far deeper cracked open inside me. Not relief, disbelief, the kind that does not pass quickly because it threatens to rearrange everything that comes after. If they would jump for me, without orders, without hesitation, then nothing about this war was as simple as I had believed, and I knew, even then, that I would never forget the sound of bodies hitting water behind me, not in fear, but in choice. The question followed me across the ocean. It followed me onto land. It followed me into America. What kind of country does this? I first asked it not in fear, but in confusion, as the ship eased into harbor and the gangway dropped with a dull metallic thud. There were no crowds waiting to jeer, no speeches, no ceremony, just movement, trucks idling, clipboards exchanged, names checked, numbers counted. Men and women stepping into place as if this, too, were simply another task to be completed correctly. We were processed quickly, efficiently, medical checks, delousing, fresh uniforms that smelled of starch and soap. Not luxury, but care. The kind that assumes bodies are worth maintaining because they will still be needed tomorrow. As we were loaded onto trains heading inland, I began to see America not through slogans, but through windows. Miles of farmland rolled past, uninterrupted. Grain silos taller than church towers, cattle grazing in numbers I could not comprehend. Towns built around rail lines and factories, smoke rising steadily into clean skies. At night, lights stretched along the tracks in patterns that did not suggest scarcity or fear, but continuity. This country was at war, and yet it did not feel starved by it. I learned later that by 1944, America was producing more than the rest of the world combined. Ships faster than submarines could sink them. Aircraft in numbers that made German engineers whisper in disbelief. Tanks, trucks, boots, blankets, everything arrived on time, in quantity, with the quiet confidence of a system that believed in planning. 12 million American men wore uniforms. And still somehow there was enough left over. That abundance followed us into the camps. The first American POW camp I saw did not resemble any prison I had imagined. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, gravel paths swept clean. Guard towers spaced wide apart, their presence more symbolic than threatening. There was wire, yes, but also open sky, space, air that did not feel compressed by despair. The rules were explained clearly. Work assignments, posted openly. Mail schedules pinned to boards. The Geneva Convention was not a rumor here, it was policy. We ate 3 meals a day. Not thin soup and black bread, but real food. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread that did not crumble into dust. I learned with a kind of stunned disbelief that our rations amounted to 3,000 calories a day. Sometimes more. More than civilians back home. More than many German soldiers at the front. Some women cried the first time they saw their plates. Others refused to eat, convinced it was a trick. Hunger resolved that argument quickly. In the afternoons, we were allowed recreation. At first, we did not know what to do with the time. Years of war had trained us to expect punishment in empty hours. But here, there were soccer balls, a baseball diamond scratched out of the dirt, a library housed in a long wooden building with shelves of donated books, novels, textbooks, even German classics. I held a book one afternoon and felt my hands shake. No one snatched it away. No one asked why I wanted it. There were radios, too. That was how I first heard Glenn Miller. The sound drifted across the camp one evening, carried by a guard's radio set down on a crate near the fence. The melody was light, confident, almost cheerful. It did not sound like a nation bracing for collapse. It sounded like people who believed the future was already theirs. Some of the guards tapped their boots in time. One of the women beside me laughed softly, surprised by the sound of her own voice. Sunday was different. Work slowed. Guards rotated with less urgency. In the distance, beyond the fence, church bell rang. Real bells, not alarms. We could not see the families gathering, but we imagined them easily. White tablecloths, roast meat, coffee poured into heavy cups, children restless, adults tired but present. Sunday dinner. The idea felt almost unreal. In Germany, Sunday had become another rationed thing, another reminder of what had been lost. Here, it still existed, intact, observed even in wartime. It was through these small things that I began to understand America. Not through speeches, not through flags, but through habits, through the way guards addressed one another by first names, through the way mistakes were corrected without humiliation, through the assumption that rules existed to be followed, not to be used as weapons. I learned America through baseball games played badly and enthusiastically by men who had never held a bat before. Through guards explaining the rules patiently, laughing when we got them wrong. Through evenings when the radio played and no one told us to turn it off. I learned it through the absence of fear. This country did not seem obsessed with proving its strength. It assumed it. That assumption was everywhere. In the factories we later glimpsed on work details, in the trains that ran on time, in the food that arrived whether we deserved it or not. Unity was not loud here. It was functional. People argued, I was sure. People complained. But when something needed to be done, ships built, fields harvested, prisoners fed, it was done without asking whether the effort was worth it. I thought of Germany then, of how everything had been filtered through ideology, suspicion, tests of loyalty, how energy had been spent measuring who belonged and who did not, rather than building something that could endure. For the first time, I understood what propaganda had tried to hide. America was not strong because it was cruel. It was strong because it did not need to be. This was the America we were warned about, and yet never truly shown. The America of systems that worked, of people who believed tomorrow was worth planning for, of a society that could fight a global war and still insist on decency toward its enemies. As weeks turned into months, the question that had followed me across the ocean began to change. What kind of country does this? The answer was no longer frightening. It was humbling. This was a country that believed order did not require terror, that dignity did not weaken authority, that treating prisoners as human beings was not charity, but confidence. And I began to understand why the men on that ship had jumped without hesitation. They were not acting against their country's values. They were living them. The question did not come to me until years later. It arrived quietly, without accusation, without anger, like a thought that refuses to leave once it has been noticed. What happened to this country? I first asked it standing on American soil long after the war had ended, long after the uniforms had changed and the fences had come down. I was no longer a prisoner then. I was a visitor, a guest, someone allowed to look without fear of punishment. And yet, it was as an outsider that I saw it most clearly. In the 1940s, America had felt like a single body moving with many limbs. Not identical, not perfect, but pointed in the same direction. There was argument, yes. There was hardship, sacrifice, loss that settled into every household like dust. But beneath it all was a shared understanding of what mattered. Work mattered, production mattered, winning mattered. And winning did not mean destroying the soul in order to defeat the enemy. This country had once believed that strength came from building, ships, planes, roads, systems, and from trusting ordinary people to carry extraordinary responsibility. Factories did not ask who you voted for. Fields did not care where you prayed. A war that large left no room for endless division. There was a common enemy then, not just Germany, not just Japan, but chaos, collapse, the idea that the world could fall apart if people stopped holding it together. I saw it in the men who guarded us without hatred, in the women who worked in kitchens and assembly lines, sending sons overseas while keeping life moving at home, in the way rules were enforced without cruelty, because cruelty would have weakened the whole machine, that America did not ask itself endlessly who deserved help. It asked what needed to be done. As an outsider, someone raised in a system obsessed with purity and loyalty tests, I noticed how little energy Americans spent questioning one another's worth. People were judged by whether they showed up, whether they did their part, whether they could be trusted to carry responsibility. That trust was not naive, it was practical. Looking back now, I wonder if Americans understood how rare that was. From the distance of time, I see a country today that often doubts itself aloud, that argues over symbols while factories rust, that questions institutions while forgetting why they were built in the first place. I see a nation still powerful, still capable, but uncertain about what kind of power it wants to be. In the 1940s, America did not seem to ask whether it was good. It acted and allowed actions to answer the question. It fed its prisoners because it could. It followed the Geneva Convention because it believed rules mattered even when no one was watching. It jumped into cold water for an enemy because leaving someone to drown would have cost more than it saved. Would it do that today? I do not know. That is not an accusation. It is an honest question, the kind only someone from the outside can ask without bitterness. Nations change. People change. Time rearranges priorities. The world after victory is always different from the world that fought for it. But I cannot forget the contrast. I cannot forget a country that once believed its moral confidence was as important as its industrial output. That decency was not weakness, but proof that the system worked. That unity did not require sameness, only shared purpose. When I speak with Americans now, children and grandchildren of those who served, I hear pride mixed with uncertainty. They know their grandparents built something immense. They feel it, but they are less certain how it was held together, or whether the same bonds still exist. As a former enemy, it is strange to say this, but perhaps distance makes clarity possible. I did not love America, chose to tell them, and slowly, cautiously, the stories changed. I told my children about America through small things, not battles, not politics. I told them about hot water poured without being measured, about blankets handed out without being counted, about guards who said please and meant it, about men who jumped into cold water for a woman they did not know and did not need to save. They listened quietly, as children do when they sense a story carries more weight than words. Later, letters began to arrive. Some were from former prisoners like me. Men and women scattered across Germany, across Europe, rebuilding lives from fragments. Others were from their children, and then from their children's children. They wrote to American families when they could find names, to camps, to towns, to anyone who might still be listening. My grandfather survived because he was treated like a human being. My mother came home alive because someone chose restraint. We exist because America did not have to be cruel, and chose not to be. I read those letters with hands that trembled, not from age but from gratitude that had never found a proper place to rest. Some Americans wrote back. They said they had never thought of it that way, that their fathers and grandfathers had rarely spoken of guarding prisoners, that it had seemed unremarkable to them, just another duty, another job done quietly and correctly. That, too, was part of the lesson. What had changed our lives forever had been ordinary to them. As time went on, I was invited, once, then again, to speak. To classrooms, to churches, to small halls where people gathered not to celebrate victory, but to understand it. I stood before Americans who had grown up on stories of triumph and sacrifice, and I told them about a moment that did not appear in textbooks. A moment when power chose restraint. I watched their faces as they listened. Some nodded slowly. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared at the floor, lost in thoughts of relatives long gone. I could see it happen. The quiet realization that their pride did not need to come from conquest alone. It could come from character. I'm often asked why I still tell this story. Why return to a war that ended decades ago? Why reopen wounds that time has worked so hard to close? The answer is simple, because memory is not nostalgia. Memory is instruction. Germany lost the war on the battlefield. That much is beyond dispute. Our cities burned. Our armies surrendered. Our ideology collapsed under the weight of its own brutality. But we were defeated forever by something else, by the humanity of those who won. That defeat did not humiliate us. It freed us. It showed us America when I arrived. I feared it. I distrusted it. I expected it to behave like every conquering power I had been taught to recognize. Instead, it behaved like a country that believed in itself enough not to prove it through cruelty. That belief was its quiet strength. If I ask what happened to this country, it is not because I think it disappeared. It is because I saw what it once chose to be. Under pressure, few nations have ever survived. And I wonder, not with judgment but with genuine curiosity, whether that choice could still be made again. Not perfectly, not easily, but deliberately. Because I learned long ago, standing on a steel deck in the middle of the Atlantic, that the truest measure of a nation is not how it treats its friends, when times are easy, but how it treats its enemies when it does not have to be kind at all. The first thing I noticed when I returned to Germany was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of rest. This was a hollow silence, the kind left behind when sound has been burned out of a place. Streets stood where streets had always been, but they no longer led anywhere familiar. Walls leaned at angles that defied purpose. Windows were holes. Roofs were memories. The war had ended, but Germany had not survived it. I stepped off the transport train carrying a single bag, lighter than the one I had brought to America years earlier. Around me, people moved carefully, as if afraid the ground itself might give way. Faces were thinner, older, eyes avoided one another, not from hostility, but from shame and exhaustion. There was no welcome. There was no explanation. Only rubble. I remember thinking, absurdly, of Sunday dinners in America, of white tablecloths and warm kitchens, of radios playing softly in the background. The memory felt almost offensive against the landscape before me, as if it belonged to another life entirely. And yet, it was real. That was what unsettled me most. America had begun to feel like a dream, too orderly, too generous, too intact to coexist with what I now saw. I spoke of it rarely at first. People did not want to hear about abundance. They did not want to hear about kindness from the enemy. They wanted stories that made sense of their suffering, not ones that complicated it. But memory has a way of insisting. Years passed. The rubble was cleared. Buildings rose where ruins had stood. Children were born who had no memory of the war except that strength does not require cruelty, that authority does not need terror to sustain it, that a nation can wield immense power and still choose to see the individual struggling beneath it. That lesson did not end in 1945. It lives on in families, in letters, in quiet gratitude passed down like an inheritance. It lives on every time someone chooses restraint when they could choose violence. Every time a rule is followed not because it must be, but because it should be. This is why we remember. Not to relive the war, but to preserve the values that outlived it. Because somewhere in the middle of an ocean, on a steel deck under a dark sky, a choice was made that echoed far beyond that moment. And because of that choice, I lived. And because I lived, my children lived. And because they lived, this story still has a voice. That is not a small thing. That is something worth remembering.